Welcome viewers. And as you know, evolutionary biology is a fascinating subject and it has many dimensions. Speciation is one of that dimension which we need to think, which we need to envisage since Darwin. And for speciation patterns, how speciation occurs, which factors or modes lead to speciation, we have quite evidences, say from Darwin's finches and other animal and plant models. So to discuss that, today we have Professor Trevor Price, who has exclusively devoted his life to study speciation pattern of birds in Himalaya, and he has been a student of famous speciation expert Professor Peter Grant. So Professor Trevor Price, how do you feel in India now?
Yeah, I feel pretty good. I've been here for about a month now, and this is my 40th visit, I think, to India.
Yeah, I have read somewhere that you have been working on Himalayan biodiversity for the last 51 years.
I came to India first 51 years ago, but I actually really started seriously working on it in 1985, maybe 40 years ago.
So what fascinated you to work on Himalayan biodiversity?
Basically, I was fascinated by the huge diversity of species, and many of them look so similar to each other that I was quite interested in trying to figure out how they'd evolved from their common ancestor.
So you did your PhD with Professor Peter Grant?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. So their work was mainly on Galapagos Islands.
That's correct.
So did it create any inspiration for you to work on Himalayan birds?
Well, I started working on Himalayan birds before I did the Darwin's finch work, and the contrast between evolution of species on islands with that on continents is very interesting and very inspiring. It's what's driven me for the rest of my career.
So can you elaborate a bit more on your work?
Yeah, so basically we originally started by looking at these warblers, which are very important insect-eating birds in India. They all look very similar to each other. They breed in one place, and the big question that people were asking in the 70s was, how do they manage to coexist in one place? So we set out to look at that, sort of understood that, and then we began to ask, how did they diverge from each other? And the way to do that is to just look at differences between the species and see if you can figure out which ones are important for them to recognize each other. And in particular, we've been very successful at looking at geographical variation within one species that leads you in the direction of another one, as a way to ask about the process of how species form.
Okay, so did you find any difference between the western and eastern Himalaya in terms of diversity?
Yeah, so the last 10, 15 years, instead of asking about how species form, we've been asking about how you manage to get so many species in one place and not another. And the fact that the West Himalaya have between 1/2 and 1/3 of all the number of species you see in the East is a very difficult problem to unravel, but has great potential in the Himalaya. So we're quite interested in understanding what it is that causes the number of species to be relatively few here. And you can do it by looking at all of the species in the East Himalaya and then asking which of those species managed to come this far, and what are their ecological attributes compared with the ones that do not come this far. And that's been our focus for the last 10 years or so.
So are there any overlaps also between eastern and western Himalaya, overlaps in terms of bird species?
Yeah, so that's the point. As a rule of thumb, maybe there's about 600 species in the east, about 300 in the west, and about 150 are shared between the two places of those. So half the species in the west are also present in the east, and 1/4 of the species in the east are also present in the west.
So those which have a sort of continuous distribution along western and eastern.
Yeah.
So is there any geographical decline or?
Yeah, so we haven't, not enough work has been done in the Himalaya looking at differences between east and west populations. But we have done quite a lot to ask, what is it about the ones that go east to west? And you can show that higher elevation ones tend to go from east to west more, and that's probably because the climate is more similar. And, you can show that ones on the plains go from east to west, probably because they don't have any difficulty getting over mountains. So together, we've got some idea about why the distributions of some species are wide and some are narrow. But actually looking within the species, is a challenge that we've only started with a few species.
So are there any set of species which may be starting from eastern Himalaya and covering the western and going up to Afghanistan and Persia?
Yeah, there's quite a few species. I think one of the most amazing features about the biogeography of the Himalaya is that if you go to 3,000 meters, just a bit over 10,000 feet, you can see species there that you can also see in America, in my backyard. For example, a wren, the raven, and virtually several other species. If you go to the bottom of the mountain, which is only 2,000 meters lower, or 3,000 meters lower, you can see species that you can see 2,000 kilometers away in Singapore, like the red-vented bulbul or a minivet. But you never see a raven at 1,000 meters or a minivet, the particular minivet that goes there up at the top. So rather remarkable. You get these huge geographical ranges, but very narrow elevational ranges, which is a focus of our work these days to understand why. Really remarkable.
That's nice. And do you find any difference between, say, species which are present in higher elevations in Tibet and Himalaya?
Difference between?
Elevational ranges?
Just to be clear, there are species that are only confined to elevations above 3,000 meters. And they would have a range, elevational range maybe going from 2,500 to from 3,000 to 3,700. At the bottom of the mountain, you might see a species that is only present at 200 meters and only goes up to 900 meters. So the range size is not that different, but they're completely different species at the top and the bottom.
So does this elevational pattern or the altitudinal pattern in case of birds, does it go well with plants and insects as well?
Yeah, well, we don't know enough about insects. I guess that's your department.
Yeah.
But trees follow very similar patterns. There are almost no tree species held in common between lower elevations and, say, 2,500 meters. You see huge turnover, which of course is going to be climate driven. Another part of our work, though, has shown that the place where you get regular freezing is an important turnover between, say, tropical species like ficus and figs. Very few go above the freezing line, and most coniferous and rhododendron species, very few come below the freezing line. So we've been looking at the freezing line quite a lot as a barrier.
As in case of insects, we have a mid-elevation peak that is around 2,000 meters. So is there a same kind of pattern in case of birds also?
Yeah, and rather remarkably, there's a peak in bird species in the East Himalaya at about 2,000 meters. There's no peak in the west. It's more like a plateau. So it's about the same number at the bottom of the mountain as at 2,000 meters in the west, and then it starts to decline. But in the east, there may be 40% more species in the middle at 2,000 than there is in the bottom. So
what could be the reasons for this?
Well, we think there's multiple reasons, but the one we've been pursuing is that there are fewer insects, as you pointed out, not just fewer species of insects, but fewer numbers of insects lower down. So that means that species that eat insects prefer to go to the 2,000 meter elevation. And the reason why there are fewer insects lower down in the east, we think has got something to do with predation from ants. So ants tend to eat, there's several species of ants that eat other insects that are very efficient. And we've experimentally shown that they can reduce insect abundance. Not only that, they tend to reduce the abundance of insects that the birds particularly like to eat. So we think this has got something to do with the fact that there's fewer species lower down, but we also believe that, as in most of biology, there's multiple explanations that are contributing.
So what are your take on, for example, generally we say that in birds, speciation is driven by assortative mating.
Yeah. Yeah, so the way species typically form, probably in most groups, including plants actually, is you have a geographical barrier and then you start to get divergence because these populations are not connected anymore. And part of that divergence means that you tend to mate with members that look like you, which is what we mean by assortative mating. So then if the barrier goes away and they come back together, the speciation is complete, they won't even look at the other species. But if it's incomplete, they may tend to mate with the other species, and then there'll be maybe selection to improve their ability to just mate with their own species.
So are there any examples? For example, introgression may have played some role?
Absolutely. So if you'd asked me 15 years ago about what happens when two species come together and hybridize, by which we mean females from one species mate with the other, I'd have said that's entirely negative and it will cause the collapse of two species back into one. But the last 15 years and the revolution in genomics has shown that species A may actually contribute valuable genes to species B that enable it to evolve to deal with, say, climate. And we've been studying that to some extent in the Himalaya.
So in Himalaya, that means in terms of divergence?
Yeah, it's not so much divergence. Maybe I sort of misspoke when we talk about the Himalaya, but one of our big pieces of work has been on what we call a ring species.
Okay.
And this is one place north of the Tibetan Plateau where the two species don't interbreed, but they're connected by a chain of populations right through the Himalaya, right through, through Western China, and then through the Himalaya, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, up to, and then at the Yenisei River north of Mongolia, there are two species. So we've done a lot of work tracing how these two species evolved into one by using space as a surrogate for time. But during the course of this work, we've discovered that these two species in the top hybridize occasionally, and hybrids backcross to the eastern species, but never to the western species. This means, for example, that a gene that enables you to deal with temperate climates in the east, but has arisen in the west, could move from the western species into the eastern species to help it adapt to those climates, but not the reverse.
But being ring species, there might be a gene flow across the whole ring.
There could be gene flow across the whole ring, so it depends on the selective pressure. So maybe there'd be a gene that would crop up that would help you deal with some parasite that everyone has, and that would go right round the ring the other way maybe. But if it's a gene that helps you deal with northerly climate, it would never have a successful route coming south. So this one gets across the top, and it could help the one on the east. That's the sort of thing we're trying to look at.
And if we look at the speciation patterns in Galapagos, and then I ask you to compare with Himalaya. So...
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. So the Galapagos is a classic example of what we call an adaptive radiation. One species arrived in the Galapagos maybe 2 million years ago and has rapidly evolved to fill a whole bunch of niches that are simply occupied in the continent. So there's a warbler finch that eats insects, and there's a woodpecker finch that eats, doesn't eat woodpeckers. It uses a stick in the absence of woodpeckers. There's a vegetarian finch that eats leaves, actually. So this radiation in the Galapagos has been driven by adaptation to different niches. On a continent, those niches were filled long ago by woodpeckers and, leaf-eating monkeys maybe. And so what is happening on continents is that you have the whole of Darwin's finches were produced in just 2 million years. Or maybe even less. If you look at two warblers in the Himalaya, they're separated from each other often by 6 million years. These species have clearly been produced in different places without diverging to utilize different niches. You just put a barrier up, their songs diverge, their genes diverge, so that they're basically different species. When the barrier goes away, they come together, and then they find a way to segregate or proportion the niche. If you like, you can think of this as a progression of an adaptive radiation. It starts off by filling niches quickly, and then as niches get filled, you have more and more of this geographical process and the jostling to find space within that niches. So we're studying right at the end of an adaptive radiation, and Darwin's finches is right at the beginning.
So when you say in Himalaya, it's 6 million years ago.
Yeah.
But given the age, that is say 30 to 40 million years ago, and then so this separation or divergence, which is 6 million years ago, so what are the reasons for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something we're investigating now. So I think the current sentiment is that the Himalaya are actually, well, maybe not the Himalaya, but Tibet has been high for maybe 60 million years. So this rise of Tibet, or at least if you want to do the Himalaya, 40 million years, obviously predates the radiations that we see. And the radiation that we see, we can date nicely, I think, now to climate. So massive climate change. There are 2 episodes of massive diversification of birds in the Himalaya. One was at 34 million years ago, and that was what we call the
Oligocene.
Eocene-Oligocene boundary.
Yeah.
So during that time, the world cooled down by 6 degrees Celsius, and we can go into the reasons why. But we know at that time there was a huge turnover in mammal species from the fossil record, and that basically is about the time the songbirds, which are now comprise about 40% of all bird species, they were hanging around in Australia and Indonesia, but they escaped from there and moved into the Himalaya associated with that cooling period.
Okay.
And before that time, there were a lot more ants and a lot more what we call non-passerine birds, including small cuckoos and so on. So they've then gone through a period of radiation through the Himalaya. And then about 6 million years ago, we had another cooling episode that's well documented now in the marine record. And that was a period which is also associated with a big mammalian extinction in the Himalaya and a transition more from browsers to grazers, more loss of forest in lowlands and more grassland. And people talk about a strengthening of the monsoon at that time. So that presumably also led to a bunch of extinctions in birds. And then we've had this radiation to fill those niches. And most of the 6 million year old species, you'll see one is at a higher elevation and one is at a lower elevation. So our hypothesis is that about that time, one of those elevations, habitats disappeared, then it reappeared, and you had evolution into that extra habitat. So you can actually relate this now, as we know more about Earth's history, to episodes of climate change, and it doesn't look like mountain building has very much to do with it.
So my question is that once they crossed, say, Himalaya, say from Indonesia and other islands, as you said, during the climate transition.
Yeah.
So what were the factors which prevented gene flow among adjacent populations?
It would have to be barriers. There would have to be, you can be far enough apart. The Himalayas certainly got plenty of barriers. Yeah. And we've found a lot of the important barriers are actually between, maybe across the Brahmaputra. So I'm blanking on the name of the mountain range to the east of the Himalaya, but there's certainly plenty of mountain ranges with enough distance between them that they could act like an ocean barrier and prevent dispersal or sufficient dispersal, so allowing radiation to go on.
So do we have any sort of ancestral history that they migrated from Indonesia and other parts?
You can use what we call phylogenetic reconstructions, right? So if you look at well, first of all, we've got fossils in Australia that indicate the songbirds arose there perhaps 55 million years ago. So we've got some fossils from Australia. But if you use DNA sequences to build a tree, then you'll find that all the old lineages, the ones that go way back in time, are Australian and Indonesian. And classically, the New Zealand wrens are the outgroup to the whole of the other radiation of these songbirds. So we've got both fossil and, historical reconstructions to indicate this is a reasonable thing. I should say there's some debate about the exact time they arose and moved into the Himalaya, but I'm sticking with mine.
My next, what I'm thinking is, for example, if you have the fossil record now, do you find any stasis in the fossil record?
We don't have a good enough fossil record in birds to say that.
Okay.
But you could, there's a tree creeper in the fossil record that looks pretty like one today from, I think, 12 to 15 million years ago. I don't know the exact date. So you can almost certainly infer stasis, right? We in the lecture today, I talked about species that are so similar. We used to call them the same species, but they're 6 million years diverged from each other. And they must have just stayed the same for that whole 6 million years, right? It's very unlikely they went away and came back again.
So given this backdrop, how do you see, when you say that they haven't changed much, how they have coped and how they are going to stay in the era of climate change?
Yeah, so the species that we're looking at tend to, as we mentioned already, one of them lives at the top of the mountain, one lives at the bottom of the mountain. Mm-hmm. So they have ranges of 1,000 meters, and they'll probably both move up the mountain a bit. But I think that in the Himalaya, if we keep the habitat, they should be able to track the habitat. They're abundant species and they can just move up a bit. I think more critical is how they would survive the winter, because many of these species are insects. So when it cools down in the Himalaya in the winter, they come into the plains of India, and you can see effects of climate change in the plains of India, particularly if you go to the western and eastern Ghats. We're seeing a disappearance of mists and fogs, and that is affecting insect abundances. So that's possibly one thing that could happen, but I feel that other threats beyond climate change are probably more important to them.
Because when we think in terms of insects, although there's no empirical evidence yet now, we generally say that they are moving up the elevation.
Yeah.
So is it impacting the bird distribution also? What do you foresee?
So our studies suggest that the birds, one of the interesting things about adapting to climate change is that if a place warms up, you can stay cool by moving up or by breeding earlier. And sometimes you see birds doing a mix. And we think part of the reason for that is that they're trying to stay in their climatic envelope, but track their insects that they eat. All of our evidence suggests, though, that what we're seeing is a decline in the lower range of a species, but the upper range is not moving. So if you have a range of a species in the Himalaya that's maybe 400 meters, now it's the bottom 100 meters has been vacated, and there's only 300 meters of that range. So the question is it moving, losing that 100 meters because it's actually tracking resources, because insects are moving up? If they are moving up, and we don't know that, is it doing it because it would have to come back earlier and to keep in its climatic envelope and it just can't come back earlier? Or is it simply doing it because populations are declining because the winter is so difficult and now there's fewer birds to come back and they prefer to go to a higher elevation? So there's a whole mix of issues here that need to be sorted out. But we should emphasize that the lack of data in general on insect declines is pretty critical. We still don't really know if insects are declining across the world or not. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. So is there any impact of Pleistocene glaciations on the radiation of birds in Himalaya?
Yeah, so I know I keep saying everything's interesting, but everything is interesting. All the information, all the evidence suggests that the Western Himalaya dried out during the glaciations and much of the forest was lost. This means two things: that if there was an endemic species in the Western Himalaya, it might have had trouble persisting and gone extinct. But if it managed to survive, it did so by moving east. Okay? So if you go to the Andes, you find more species are present in the Andes and the Himalaya. And one striking reason for that is that different mountaintops in the Andes have different species on them. So they radiated in the Pleistocene. These are young species that have been preserved, and the climatic history suggests that, in fact, the Andes always stayed climatically suitable for birds. But in the Himalaya, it seems like the West Himalaya was not suitable, and many times during the ice ages, forcing either species to go extinct or move to the east. And so that's why you see less species in the Himalaya than the Andes, or at least part of the contribution. So we don't see anything like the radiation that we see in the Andes. But when you think about the glaciations, they've been going for 2 million years, and it can take 2 million years for species to develop sufficiently that they won't breed together at the end of a radiation. Darwin's finches can do it, they go to different niches. But continental species, 2 warblers, they would take a long time, so they could have just hybridized and merged back again.
So that's the kind of ecological speciation which was there in Darwin's finches.
Darwin's finches, classic example of ecological speciation, and maybe these warblers we study are a classic example of what we call mutation order speciation, where divergence just happened not by adapting to different environments, but by just accumulating different mutations.
So Professor Price, you have worked on color vision also. Yeah, so tell us something about that.
Well, that is I shouldn't say it. Well, birds are famous because they have they can see in the UV, so that's what everyone likes. But one of the biggest problems, I think, in unsolved, interesting evolutionary problems is the diversity of color in nature. Why is one bird red and one bird blue? And so we've been setting out to ask if maybe the reason is red birds females can see or distinguish red colors. Color vision of the birds differs accordingly with the color of the birds. And in doing this, we've got really interested in the evolution of color vision. And the first work we did was to basically ask if different species have different opsin genes, which are the genes that allow you to detect different wavelengths of light. And we did that, and I could talk about a couple of very interesting results that we found, but maybe I'll just mention one, which is if you look at gene expression, so the amount of opsin being produced in the eye, it's sexually dimorphic, with females producing more opsin in their eyes than males. But this is a study that was done on North American warblers. If you look at a monomorphic warbler, where the male and the female look the same, they have the same opsin expression in the eye. But if you look at a dimorphic warbler, like the black-throated blue warbler, the males are bright blue and the females are dull brown. The female has much more opsin, blue opsin being expressed in her eye than the male does. And we think we've got some models that suggest that this will enable her to distinguish different shades of blue in the male and make a better choice of mate.
But this opsin is the product of gene duplication.
Well, a long time ago, yeah. Long time ago.
So now if there is a variable expression, what could be the reason for this?
Well, just turning on and off genes is a very quick way to alter, the phenotype.
Yeah.
So actually,
that could be due to environment or epigenetics.
Or just actually genetics. All you have to do is have a promoter region with a mutation in it, or a new sexually, sex-limited protein that binds to the promoter region. About half the genes in humans, I think, are differentially expressed in males and females. Yeah. And also expression varies through the day. So it's not very difficult to change expression. It's much harder to change opsin gene sequences. In fact, in fish, genes are turned on and off through their development. So you can express one gene early on and one later.
So 51 years down the line, can you narrate some interesting story in the field?
We've had many adventures, of course. I'm trying to think if you want a story about birds.
Story about your field work.
Yeah, I suppose I could talk about some of the, you mean just living in the field?
Mm.
Well, here's one story that we might, I suppose I'm allowed to say now, which is many people have fallen down a glacier in Kashmir. We put one or two people have broken their wrists or something like that, but nothing too serious.
Okay.
But I was in Kashmir, and there was an army general who asked me to introduce his teenage son to birding, which is quite a reasonable thing to ask. So this son came and stayed with us, and he was walking across a glacier one day and started to slip. And I thought, if he falls down this glacier, I'm going to be, in front of a firing squad. So I ran onto the glacier and grabbed him. And then, we thought, well, what to do? We can't let him go out of camp. So we put him back in camp. And Kashmir's full of skinks.
Yeah.
And they look like little snakes. So we told him they were little poisonous snakes. And that kept him quiet for the next few days. I don't know if that's the sort of story you want to hear, but we've been through.
Being a field biologist, I know that we face so many troubles and so many adventures are there in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've had a few, times when the snow has caused our tent to cave in the middle of the night. And we've had a few occasions when we've got completely lost and very scared about it. So that, there's a lot of stories like that. But, who would give up living in the Himalaya for that?
And finally, you just give some suggestions that, given your work on Himalayan biodiversity, how we should proceed or how we should think in terms of some action plan or some efforts which could lead to conservation.
Yeah, well, I think, as you know, it seems, well, there's two things. One is, if we don't do something about climate change, then everything's off the map. But we hope that because climate change is such a threat to humanity, that will be corrected. So if that's true, then, in my view, we need to preserve habitat as well as we can, and it needs to be as large an area as we can, because top predators such as tigers need a large area, and they're a very important part of the ecosystem. You can't remove the tigers and hope to keep an intact community. So, in my view, we should be focused on keeping the major tiger reserves as sacrosanct as possible. And in my view, the way to do that is to make them economically more viable than any other option, with ecotourism being one obvious way to do that, but possibly other ways as well.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Trevor Price. It was nice interacting with you, and nice to learn what you have done over the years, say 51 years in Himalaya. So it was a very wonderful session and a very informative session, in fact, because I also learned a lot about your work, and it was quite interesting. And of course, it is very inspiring for the young minds also.
I really appreciate being asked to do this, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much. And viewers, I hope you enjoyed this discussion, this interaction, sort of interview, what we did with Professor Trevor Price at EMRC Punjabi University Patiala. And in future, we will continue with these kind of efforts so that we can elaborate more on different kind of subjects. Thank you very much.